You're listening to Black Music Scene, a show where we explore the incredible journeys, challenges, and triumphs of Black orchestral musicians who've dedicated their lives to the craft, breaking barriers and defining what it means to be a virtuoso. We're here to celebrate and archive the awe-inspiring stories of our living legends in Black classical music. On today's episode, we'll meet George Lewis, a Chicago-born trombonist, technologist, musicologist, and composer. He's the artistic director of the International Contemporary Ensemble and the Edwin H. Case Professor of American Music at Columbia University. He's widely recognized as a trailblazer in modern music, particularly for his groundbreaking work in creating computer programs that improvise alongside human musicians in live performance. Over his remarkable career, George has explored the vast possibilities of sound through electronic and computer music, multimedia installations, in both notated and improvised forms of music. His innovative contributions are documented on more than 150 recordings. At 72, George continues to be a dynamic force in music, with his work being performed and premiered all over the world. This is your host, David Norville, and today I'm joined by one of the Black Orchestral Network Steering Committee members, Shay Scruggs. Today, we'll get a chance to talk to George Lewis about his upbringing, learn about influential forces like the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, or AACM, and we'll learn how George designed electronics that can improvise with humans live in concert. And of course, we'll hear his music. This is Black Music Scene, cultivating community, lifting our voices, and telling our stories.
Hi everyone, I'm George Lewis. I'm a composer, technologist, a musicologist, and professor of music at Columbia University. I'm the son of George Lewis and Cornelia Lewis, who are no longer with us but have left their great stamp on me.
I'm wondering about early life and your initial interest in music, initial interest in sounds. What are some of your earliest memories being interested in music?
Boy, my earliest memories, I'm going to have to dig into the old neurons and see if they fire at all. It's been a long time. My parents, and indeed my entire family, were interested in music. I think my dad's favorite was jazz and my mother's favorite was R&B. And so I grew up with those. But also they liked stuff like Roy Rogers. So my first record was Roy Rogers' Happy Trails. And the other thing they liked was technology, I think, because my dad liked anything that was connected with technology I guess it ended up being something that would reproduce music. So he worked on radio. He never had a job in radio. He worked in the post office, but he could fix TVs and radios. Back when you could still fix these things by going in the back and fixing them. You can't do that anymore. And so I learned a bit of that as well. But yes, those were early signs. There was always music around the house. Nobody played any musical instruments.
How were you first introduced to a musical instrument then?
I changed schools. I went from the local public school on the south side of Chicago, which I think it was designed to discourage Black children from doing anything. And one of the teachers went to my parents and said, "You have to get this kid out of here, and here's how you're going to do it." And they said, "You're going to send him to this University of Chicago laboratory school." And parents said, "Well, we can't really afford that." I said, "Well, you'll be able to afford it. They'll give you money for that. But you have to do it because you have to get him out of here." So they did get me out. And that was probably a lifesaver. But in any event, the first thing that happened there was they were trying to recruit for bands. And so they took us to the music store, and I looked around, and we had a conversation with my parents about what kind of instrument I'd like to take up. He said, well, you can take up any instrument you want except the trumpet. And I said, well, why the trumpet? What's wrong with the trumpet? So he showed me a picture of Louis Armstrong's lips. I guess Louis Armstrong was a super player, of course, but in terms of the technology of brass, he kind of looked like he played the old way, where you mash your lips in. Mm-hmm. People don't do that anymore. A lifetime of doing that, my dad said, you don't want your lips looking like that. I said, well, maybe not. So then we went to the music store, and I think I just picked the shiniest and the biggest thing there, which was a trombone. It wasn't any particular thing like, I have to hear this because I heard this or that. No, I didn't know about any of them really. So I was able to trust my parents and say, well, this is a good thing to do in order to sort of help with social adjustment. The old school, of course, was 100% black and segregated, and the new school was 98% white. So that's a big difference, and so they felt that somehow maybe playing an instrument and being a part of that would be helpful. And it kind of was.
I see. I'm wondering, too, about initial progress with the instrument. Was it a thing where you found yourself playing a lot or practicing a lot, or was it primarily at school? Yeah.
I just wrote a piece for trumpet and electronics, which was premiered at a music festival in Witten, Germany. And the piece is called Buzzing, which is what you do when you play a brass instrument. You buzz, it's like, you do that. But I didn't know that, and neither did Ray Anderson, the great trombonist who started the same day I did. So we went into the school, they gave us our instruments, and we started blowing into them. Of course, nothing happened. And so the music teacher, Frank Tiro, said, well, in order to play a brass instrument, you have to engage in buzzing. And then he showed us how to buzz, and then he showed us how to buzz the instrument, and then we started buzzing away, and then that's how it started. Now, yes, of course, who likes to practice? No one liked that. You said you were an oboe player. Maybe it went better for you. Me, it was like, well, let's do something else today. But my dad said basically, well, your mom paid for this instrument, and if you don't practice, it's disrespectful to her. And I said, well, I can't do that. So, yeah. But still, it was very difficult. And at a certain point, it became very frustrating. The trombone is an instrument that, I don't know, maybe the oboe is kind of similar. You reach it's very hard to play at first, you sound terrible. Maybe for years, you sound bad. And then one day, if you overcome a certain thing, you sound okay. And I told my dad that I wanted to quit. I didn't like doing this. And he said, well, I could see why. I said, why? Well, because you sound terrible. He said, well, so what do I do about that? Well, I'll tell you what. When you start to sound good, you can quit if you want. So I didn't realize that was a trick. So the whole thing was to try to get as good as I could so I could quit. But by the time I felt good enough about it, I didn't really want to quit, at least for a while. I've always been a little ambivalent about it anyway. It's not like I wake up every morning and thinking I must play the trombone. In fact, I stopped playing about 10 years ago. But still, it was something where you wanted to sound good, and eventually not just for your parents, but for the other people you were playing
What are some other life-changing lessons that you received from your parents? What were some things that they frequently either harped on or things that sat with you and had a great impact on you from the way they raised you?
Well, it's all very personal. I liked building things. My dad was an electronics person, so he showed me about, I was 5 years old. He didn't have anybody to talk to about this because he wasn't really working in the field. So he would go on with these long-winded lectures about Ohm's law and how to tell a resistor from a capacitor on I had a circuit diagram, stuff like this. I had no idea what any of this was. Then about 20 years later, I started getting into computers. You had to build a power supply from a circuit. So I looked at the circuit and I said, wow, I know what this stuff is. How do I know this? So it was kind of weird. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, of course, he would get really mad if you didn't read the instructions. So always read the instructions first. So I don't know if those are universal life lessons, but they do help you get by. The other thing to remember is not to impose them on your kids. You help them find their own way, maybe. Can you turn my mic up a little bit? On va remarquer que je fais quelque chose avec le tableau de mixage.
What you're hearing now is George Lewis introducing one of his pieces at the Pompidou Center back in 1984 in Paris. He's explaining his innovative musical computer program to the audience, a program designed to track and interact with each musician for a specific duration, providing quick and personalized responses to the performers.
Vite la réponse au musicien, c'est un peu personnel, c'est tout.
So I'd like to go back in time, Mr. Lewis, to, I think I would say for you age maybe 17, 18, 19. I'd like to talk a bit about the sort of inception of you joining the AACM. From what I understand, it was 1971 at the time?
Yes, I became a member of the AACM in 1971, but I first heard about the AACM through my trombone playing friend, Ray Anderson, who took me to AACM concerts. I didn't understand anything. And all the people that I didn't understand, I ended up performing with them. And I guess that's a good way to learn while you figure things out. But I would see Fred Anderson. I said, what's this? I went to see the Art Ensemble of Chicago. I was scratching my head. But then I went away to school, Yale, for a year or two, and took a gap year. They didn't call it that then, but I took a year off. Went back home and met the members of the AACM. I mean, they had invited Muhal Richard Abrams to the campus. And they had our music teachers, Frank Tiro and Dean Hay. They had improvisation classes. They had listening sections. One student brought in John Coltrane's Ascension. I brought in the stuff I understood, which was Lester Young and Oscar Peterson. And then someone brought in another Coltrane work, Live at the Village Vanguard again. This is post-1965. And I thought, well, I like this. This is the kind of thing I can get with. So that was kind of the beginning of a lifelong obsession. By the time I got to a totally random encounter in my neighborhood with the AACM, I didn't know anything about what they were doing, but I could hear the roots of what they were doing.
I see.
And they let me come in and play, which was great. They were interested in cultivating young people.
Wow.
So I told them I was a trombone player, and a couple people said, I don't believe that. I think Pete Cozy said, "Are you kidding me?" But in the end, they let me play anyway, and they kept letting me play.
In my own research and learning about the AACM, I am, continuously floored and inspired by the levels of awareness and sort of consciousness that came along with the group. I'm wondering, from the time that you began going to the concerts and began to understand more and more, how did that time stretch your understanding of the music? How did that time sort of stretch your ears, your consciousness? What was it that you maybe didn't understand that you began to understand over time?
I think the first thing was that people weren't interested in the music. They were just interested in music. And they were not interested in being labeled or typecast or stereotyped or policed about that. So much later, when I began writing my book, and Muhal gave me copies of some of the recordings that they made of their early meetings, including the very first meeting where they organized the whole thing, and then the meeting which they decided they made up the name AACM, which was based on numerology. So the thing they were interested in was, first of all, the music could set you free, and that we should listen to everything, and not just the music we were told was important for us or was best suited. It's like that thing I read in the paper about Willie Mays, where they said he worked in an instinctual way. I said, "You kidding me?" I mean, no. Or the Isaiah Thomas thing about basketball, where they were saying it was all instinctual and nobody ever practiced or did anything. All of that had to be fought in every field of Black endeavor, and certainly the AACM was one of those. I went to the AACM school. The only thing that was taught was composing. Those were my first and probably only composition lessons that I can think of. They started you off with a sort of protocol they gave everyone, including the modes of the major scale, which they had a different name for. A lot of it was based on Joseph Schillinger's principles, which Muhal had studied and Charles Stepney had studied, and probably Eddie Harris and B.B. King and people like that, Earl Brown. They were all studying this method. There's these huge books you had to buy. So I bought the books, but not until later, and they were very difficult to read. So they gave you another version, and then they gave you the basics. They said, come back with a piece. That was your first week. The second week, you had to come back with a piece. And so who was going to play your piece? Well, you realized that string quartets weren't sitting around waiting for you to play pieces. So you had to play your own piece. And so the AACM was a composers organization in those days. People would play each other's music, and they'd organize the concerts. So if they weren't playing your music, you had to clean the bathroom. So stuff like that. So, yeah. So you learned a lot about collectivity, you learned a lot about support, you learned a lot about service to other people. And that was the whole purpose of it, really, was to serve not just yourself and your career, but the community. After a while, you teach in the school as well as study in the school. And the school was free. When I was there, the youngest student was 8. So the oldest was like 50 or 60. So it was a little red schoolhouse kind of setup.
Lovely. Speaking of ideals, I think about one of the sort of phrases that I heard and read a lot while doing research is this idea of non-hierarchical structures or non-hierarchy when it comes to either the music that you're writing or the AACM. I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about this principle of non-hierarchical collective.
Yeah, I guess that also turns up in thinking about interactive computer music. So maybe the interactive computer music that I do is influenced heavily by the AACM, particularly the ideas about multi-instrumentalism. You had the art ensemble. They had 1,000 instruments up there on the stage, and the trumpet wasn't more important than a ratchet or a gong. And so that's one sense of non-hierarchical. So there were instruments, and then there were little instruments. And you had to learn how to play the little instruments in the same way you learned how to play the others, and how to be sensitive and how to create sonic environments. The other thing was that the AACM was radically democratic. Everyone had to vote on just about everything, And then it was very odd because sometimes you'd vote on one thing and the next week it'd be a different group of people and they'd vote that thing out. But that's some of the pitfalls and the promise, but also the pitfalls of that kind of radical democracy. People would come and they wanted to impose hierarchy or dogmas or whatever. No one said you can't do that, but no one really bought into it either. So it just became a non-dogmatic space where you could try anything. That's the only way you can really do that, is if you go into the situation without preconditions. And the other thing about that is, when I came into academia many years later, I was often told you have to maintain a critical faculty, or you have to tell students the truth about their work. And in the ACM, people always thought you already knew the truth about your work. And so, or if you didn't, you'd find out by doing the kind of introspection that everyone else was doing. And there wasn't anything to be afraid of. And you certainly need someone telling you, well, here's how it is. You didn't need that. So you learned not to do that. And you learned to kind of suspend judgment, kind of indefinitely, because the world wasn't waiting on your judgment. So after a while, that became something, at least that was my experience. There were a lot of people that came over the AACM. There was generational shift. It started in 1965. It's still going. It's entering its 60th anniversary next year. But I think a lot of the ideals are still the same. And if you talk to 100 different people who have been through the AACM, all the founders have passed away, but the organization has still managed to maintain a presence in Chicago and in New York City. So that's sort of the outcome of this sort of non-hierarchical way of thinking.
The rhythm takes me. Take me back to when I was black and hidden proud. Talking about your mama. The rhythm. Take me back to when I was black. 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 Glory. Take me back to when I was black. 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 Where music began. Now jump forward through history's dice game. Pick up the steps, pick up the dance of five brothers about your mama.
I love what you said about being radically democratic. I see some similarities. When you say that phrase, I see some connections to the how of how Black Orchestral Network operates as well. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work with the Black Avant-Garde and...
Which one?
Right.
Which Black Avant-Garde do you mean? Over the decades, I've had a lot, and I continue to develop new connections with what we would think of as the Black Avant-Garde. Now, early on, and I didn't know who these people were. I mean, they were constantly introducing me to people who are these people? It was like, what are they doing? One of the people was Jeff Donaldson, who was one of the co-founders of the Afro-Cobra visual art movement, and he and Muhal were great friends, and they started their organizations at about the same time, but they were visual artists, Barbara Jones Hogu, Jay Jarrell, Wadsworth Jarrell, and other people. And they would do joint events together. They would try to crash events where the white avant-garde wasn't paying attention to them. They would crash those events in Chicago and things of that sort. And I ended up writing about them in scholarly articles and things. And then there was a Black Avant-Garde that was connected with BAG, the Black Artist Group in the AACM. I kind of became involved in that. And more recently, I got to know people like the late Terry Adkins, the wonderful abstract sculptor and painter, who was also heavily involved with music and sound art. Or I just finished an article about Jack Whitten, the abstract painter, and his influence from quantum mechanics. Or working with people like Arthur Jafa. So there are a lot of Black avant-gardes out there, and I wish I knew more about a lot of them. And so I'm just trying to stay open to things. And because it's an international group, I've written a lot, and I've worked with Stan Douglas and on his work. So I've written articles about his film and video work, and I've also performed in one of his film works. And he's Afro-Canadian, grew up in Vancouver. And right now, there's a black avant-garde in the UK and in Germany. Having lived in those countries, I've been involved in that. So I guess there's just a lot of that going on. I think when we think about that, the term I've developed is an Afro-diasporic point of view, sort of like our recent edited volume, Composing While Black, with Harold Kisidu, the Afro-German musicologist. It's called Afro-diasporic New Music Today, oder if you're German, it's bilingual Afro-diasporische Neue Musik heute. And the idea is to think about people like Ben Patterson, who lived in Germany, but he was a co-founder of Fluxus, an American artist, another part of the black avant-garde, or people like Elaine Michener in the UK, the wonderful singer and movement artist, or Andile Khumalo, the South African composer. So there's a lot of black avant-gardes out there, and there are more coming up. And a lot of there's too many to talk about. Concentration is interrupt.
Mr. Lewis, one of the things that I'm interested in being able to document or provide for our audience is being able to sort of talk about the steps that went into your interest and then work in improvisational computer programming and interactive computer music. So what I'm understanding is that from an early age, your father helped to lay a sort of groundwork for understanding a lot of this electrical, maybe not engineering, but programming and things like that. I'm wondering at what
they didn't have programming when he was growing up. I mean, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
no
they
problem.
didn't have, it was electronics,
Yes.
And that day it was tubes, right? It wasn't transistors. Transistors. The transistor was invented in 1957. I was 5 years old. But it quickly got into all these places, right? So by the time I was 7 or 8, they had transistor radios and all that. But programming, that came a lot later. I would say I didn't start programming. Well, they had Fortran in my grade school, but I was very bad at that. Do loops. It was, and they had these cards. The cards you put in, the punch cards. I just couldn't. I just couldn't do it. It was too abstract for me. Then in around 1975, meeting people like Anthony Braxton, one of the wonderful AACM members, who introduced me to members of other avant-gardes that were out there, like the post-Cage people, David Behrman and Richard Teitelbaum in particular, the Sonic Arts Union, Bob Ashley and David Behrman, Gordon Muma, who work, and these people were working in electronics. They're working with John Cage and Merce Cunningham, and that's just a thumbnail sketch what was happening there. Christian Wolff and Earl Brown and these kinds of people. So I went to California with the Belgian composer Jacques Bécard, and he introduced me to a lot of these people who were working on interactive computers. They had a group called the League of Automatic Music Composers. And they had their computers set up in a network, a local area network. It was Rich Gold, who I've written about, and John Bischoff, Tim Perkis, who else? David was in there. Oh, Jim Horton, who passed away. It sounded like people improvising. And in a way it was. It was improvisation, but the computers were doing the improvising. And I said, wow, I'd like to do that. And I bet I could do it. And then there instantly these other people, not these people, but other people said, oh, you can't really do that. I mean, you maybe learn the program. That sounds complicated, and maybe you could get someone to do it for you. And I thought, well, no, I don't know, man. I'm a Yale philosophy graduate. I think I can do whatever I want. How hard can it be? All you have to do is count to 2. So I had a lot of help from these people and others, and especially David. But I started to think about, at first, computers, it was like a gadget, right? How could you get a computer to improvise? But then in order to do that, you had to think about, well, what's improvisation? What is it? How does it work? And then you started to see that a lot of the explanations that were proffered in the scholarly literature, it had nothing to do with the lived experience of musicians. By that time, I had to play with a lot of very interesting people. I'd played with Count Basie, I played with Anthony Braxton, I've had played with Gil Evans, I played with a lot of people. None of those people were doing it the way that the book said. So you had to figure out your own way. And so you realized the computer could be a tool that you could use to, number one, develop a conception of music theory about improvisation, and also to put that theory into practice by putting it on the stage and interacting with it, which is the most intimate way to learn something, by it actually hands-on interaction or ears-on interaction. So that's where it kind of started for me, and that's where it continues. And so I continually learn new things about improvisation. Let me put it this way. I was very influenced, I think a lot of us were, by people like Marvin Minsky in particular, the MIT founder, really you could consider him a co-founder of AI. But he was a musician too, and he was one of the only ones writing about improvisation in the context of AI. In fact, the current AI people, the ones you hear about, ChatGPT, there's no talk about improvisation because none of their machines can do it. Wow. So, because they haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, or maybe they don't know what it is, or there's a Western bias against improvisation anyway. They don't think it's that important. So if you don't think it's important, you're not going to try to get your machines to do it. In other words, software comes out of the lived cultural and political experience of the people who make it. And any software that you see is going to reflect that community. So if you want to see why these things do the crazy things they do, all you have to do is look at the people programming them, or why they do the nice things they do. It's because of that. But these lessons were learned or theorized or whatever on the basis of interacting with computers. So making these kinds of computer programs is a humanistic endeavor for me, as I think it was for this first generation of AI people.
I love that you started to talk about AI. One of the questions that I had, and Shay, feel free to jump in if you have anything that's burning, because this is interesting for me. I'm wondering, how do current conversations around AI relate to conversations that you had when you started developing, musical programming? I remember listening to lectures where, I think you had shared maybe there were certain attitudes around, well, why would you want this to do that, and why would you want to play with this? And I'm wondering how conversations today might relate or compare to conversations that you had when you first began.
Well, the difference is the machines are so powerful now that there is a why to why would you want to do it. But the why is not a why I'm particularly interested in. The reason why my generation wanted to do it, and it is generational, is that we were interested in what it was like to be human and how we could use computers to do that. So there's a humanistic impulse, as I've said. Maybe a lot of the current conversations for me, I missed the humanistic aspect. And it seems more based on the why being, I now have power. But what kind of power can you have if someone else is basically pulling all the strings and all you can really do is scour the internet and create variations on what you do? One of the questions that often arises with us was, what is originality? Well, the easy answer is there's no such thing. But the harder answer is that new things do arise. So where do they come from? I remember reading something in Black World, the old magazine, about something Max Roach said, where he said that originality comes from the fact that you're born and you're you, and there's never going to be another one like you, unless you choose to make yourself like someone else, which some people do in music. But they were thinking about expressing their personal voice, and if you did that, you were being true to yourself, and you were contributing to the society as well, to Black society in particular, which needed originality desperately, and the kind of originality that would move mountains and change minds and worlds. So that's why they were really death on these old timers. They were death on you. They see you with one of these jazz pattern books. They say, what are you doing with that? Get that out of here. Throw that away. So I say, well, I got to learn my scales. You don't need that to learn your scales. Here. We'll come over to my house. We'll practice together. Or whatever they're going to do. Because they felt that these things were creating like clones. So what I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to create improvisation, create interactive computer music, or use the new AI tools without having to necessarily foreground the corpus as the sort of training set as the origin of and the measure of all things. And I'm thinking back to something happened to me just recently. Before I started, and before a lot of us started, around 1968, there was a guy named Harold Cohen, who was a painter, British painter. And later I became his colleague at UC San Diego. But he was one of the, major British painters, young British painters. He had shows at the Venice Biennale and all that. And one day he got interested in AI, or what AI was back then. You couldn't scour the internet. There really wasn't internet. You had to algorithmically create a program that would do what you wanted it to do. He wanted his computer program to paint pictures and draw things. So he built it, and by golly, it worked. And he was able to get the thing it had a personality. It drew pictures, very elaborate ones. At first it started, as he learned more about what pictures were all about, if he learned more about how to express yourself in terms of what perspective was or what closed and open forms were. So by the time I read about it, I think it was in Scientific American or something, I said, this is just like what I'm doing. I'm not as far along with it, but I see where you could go based on what this guy's doing. So I get to UCSD in 91 as a new professor, and the first person I went to after the music department was Harold's studio. I said, where is Harold Cohen's studio? So I went to him, and after a lot of hemming and hawing, he let me in. He could be a curmudgeonly guy. And I saw these elaborate paintings that looked like Gauguin with these forests of trees and forests and bushes and everything, and these figures doing these incredible sort of dances. And I said, well, wow, Harold, this is amazing. So you're not using the computer anymore? He said, oh, no. I said, uh-oh. Guess I got a way to go here. I mean, by that time, I had already built virtual improvising orchestras and things like that. Mm-hmm. And this was at the Whitney Biennial. So the top floor had a retrospective of Harold's work, and I was just reintroduced to how wonderful this work was and how it had a personality. And he'd gotten the computer. He didn't like the word personality. He called it entitality. I said, I know, Harold, I'm going to stick with personality on that. But, that seems a little too granular for me. But anyway, he wanted to make a clear distinction between the computer and the human. I wasn't that interested in that. And right now, that's called co-creation. The idea is that the computer and the human create together. Well, I'm perfectly happy if my computer does all the creating. I've been doing that for 30 years. Thing is that the whole goal of it was to get the machine to play by itself and make something good. Because if it didn't have anything to bring to the table, why do you want to play with it? And then why would other people want to play with it? And I continue to get critique from people. Fred Anderson, the great saxophonist who I played with, listened to the record I did with Roscoe Mitchell. And he said, your computer's having a hard time keeping up with Roscoe, isn't it? I said, well, yeah, I'm getting better at it. And that was in 91, 92. So I think it does keep up a little better these days.
You said something a while back that really jumped out to me, which was the people that are creating these algorithms, the people that are creating these tools, the tools themselves are absorbing the biases and the context of the people that create them. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and how that might apply in music and how you bring that to bear in your teaching.
Well, let me give you a couple of further examples first. There's the Algorithmic Justice League of Joy Buolamwini, who is working on biases in facial recognition and why people's computer programs think that black people and dark-skinned women are criminals. You have to expect there is no unbiased objective space. So what you really need is you need a lot of diversity. That's a real use of diversity, or what I'm calling these days new complexity. because diversity is like a buzzword now, but it's a very complex and fraught topic, and trying to engage in it is very difficult, and it has a lot of discontents. When I started doing this, when I was able to get to the stage where I could put more than one computer on stage playing, improvising at the same time, I had 3 of them on stage at IRCAM in Paris in 1984 and 4 live musicians. But I realized that they were all clones of each other, and so they all sounded kind of the same. They played the same things over time. They made local temporal decisions differently, but over the course of time, they all sounded like one big machine. And that's how Steve Lacy and Douglas Ewart and Joe Alejandro and Derek Bailey heard it, as the machine. So other people started doing this a little bit later. So I think sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s, there's a wonderful Mexican composer, Roberto Morales Manzanares, and he made a fantastic interactive computing system. And for the first time, I heard 2 computers improvising together that wasn't a kind of codependency, that they were really challenging each other, and you could hear it. Whether I heard it as a challenge, what they heard it as, I really have no idea. But it was not like putting 2 of my machines together. No matter how sophisticated they were, they started to do the same kinds of things, and then the result was kind of dull. So what, in terms of teaching, the lesson I get from that is that we do need a lot of different points of view. At Columbia, in the composition program that we have, is now majority female by a considerable number, not just sort of barely majority, but almost a supermajority, which is, I think, almost unheard of in American and European academia. A quarter of the students are Black, and they win giant awards, like Tyshawn Sori got a MacArthur, Courtney Bryan got a MacArthur, Hannah Kendall is a major figure, Jesse Cox, he got a big job at Harvard University just now. So these people are doing amazing things, but they're not towing any kind of line or any kind of, well, this is a shared aesthetic or we're cloning them. We're promoting diversity. I mean, the majority of the program are students of color. It's international, too. So you get all these people from all over the world, and you have to craft that program. It's not just about teaching. It's also about administering and nurturing and fostering. In the old days, I used to wonder why academic music faculties couldn't be more like the AACM. But then I realized why that couldn't happen. Because academic music faculty, there's a certain part of academia in which you are required to blow your own horn to achieve success.
I see.
And that happens in other worlds of music, commercial music as well, or trying to just win space for yourself in an almost stochastic environment. Why should someone pick you over someone else? But internally in the AACM, there was no reason to consider one person better than anyone else. So you can bring that value right into academia, and you just let people find out who they are, and you try to help them to find out who they are instead of saying, well, if your music was more like this, because I don't know it all. Let me say this. People in the AACM were very interested in contemporary and other kinds of classical music. I mean, I remember interviewing Henry Threadgill. He went to all the concerts of Ralph Shapey and Easley Blackwood at the University of Chicago. He met Edgar Varese there. Around 1971, Eileen Sutherland's book came out, The Music of Black Americans. Until that time, a lot of people didn't think Black composers existed. I went to Yale in 1971, and my roommate, the violinist who passed away recently, Miles Hoffman, I just wrote a piece for him in his honor, and he heard it before he passed away. And he was playing in the Yale Symphony. He said, look, George, I got this amazing piece. It's kind of weird because, he didn't like new music that much. But anyway, he said, you got to hear it. So I went to the concert. It was kind of wild. It was called Mestizo 2. And then the composer came out to take a bow, and it was a Black guy. I said, what? I said, I must meet this guy. And that's how I met Alvin Singleton. And we've been friends all these years. And, I look up to him as a important... I didn't really... I didn't study with him, but I still look up to him as an important mentor and example whose music I greatly admire, and just his whole thing, So a major figure in music as far as I'm concerned. So we need these kinds of people. And in our book, Harold Kisidu, he does an oral history with Alvin that talks about he was the first Black person to get performed at Darmstadt, the first Afro-diasporic composer in 1972. And then Andile Khumalo, my former student from South Africa, was the second in 2009, and I was the third in 2018. So, so these things are working very slowly. So there was a need for a book, Composing While Black. But we were interested in finding out who these people were. Who was Ollie Wilson? Who was Dorothy Rudd Moore? Who was Florence Price? Who were all these people? And Harold is writing about the Society of Black Composers. They had Tanya Leon and Talib Rasul Hakim, Julius Eastman, T.J. Anderson, Carmen Moore, all kinds of people. So my feeling is that if we're not hearing from these voices, the field devolves. It becomes impoverished. And what happens when fields become impoverished, that the smart people leave. And so I feel I have to defend my field to make sure the smart people don't leave, that they continue to find interesting things here. And it does become, I guess the term would be decadent. So that's another reason to have this new complexity. In terms of writing for orchestra, I mean, other than my lessons in the AACM, I'm pretty much a self-taught person. But that was it. The AACM was a society of autodidacts. Muhal taught himself looking at the Schillinger books, and all that. So you go to rely on yourself, but also you do the research. And so being at Columbia, being at UCSD, working with people like Brian Fernyhough, who was one of the first new complexity people. I think either he or Richard Barrett or somebody, Michael Fennessy, invented that term. And then we brought Anthony Davis in, I mean, he was writing these operas, incredible operas. I mean, at a certain point, going back to the ACM, Joseph Jarman says, well, if you're a musician, you're responsible for all the music on earth. So that's your remit. And I'm finding that people who settle for less than that are not serving us as well as they could. And so rather than scolding them, we just want to say, well, have you looked at this? Or have you seen this? And that's what we tell the students in the private lessons. We might talk about anything. So have you looked at this? And they say the same thing to me. Well, George, have you checked this out? So it's become an exchange. The AACM, again, Muhal would say, I'm not talking about so-called teachers and so-called students, non-hierarchical, once again. So in terms of what I'm doing, I'm just trying to be as nonlinear and confrontational in your face as possible with the orchestral music. The last piece was called Weathering, which is based on it has what I call the not this again chord, which happens over and over. The not another microaggression, please, no, And so this chord represents the continuous wearing down that oppressed people go through. Even those who on paper look as though they're doing pretty well. They might, whether it's Colin Powell or the guy who started BET or whoever. They can all walk into the wrong place, and and what did Malcolm X say? What do they call a black man with a PhD? Well, we know the answer. So you're going to see that when you are thinking about it along those ways, what you come up with is a notion of the possible creolization and decolonization of contemporary classical music, which I think is already in progress. And I'd recommend to everyone they look at, if you want to see creolization in action in the 18th century, go see that movie, Run, Don't Walk, Chevalier, which is the whole point of that is about classical music with roots in slavery, in fact, and the Enlightenment itself with roots in slavery, and the idea that contemporary classical music can come from black mothers. And so it's all there in that movie. And the part about Mozart, well, some people are just very dour. I mean, he has a jam session with Mozart and he wins. Well, what do you expect? He's the star of the show for once instead of Mozart.
You received an honorary doctorate from the Curtis Institute of Music recently, and I had the privilege of attending the ceremony and hearing your remarks. And what you were talking about a few minutes ago reminded me of something that you said. You said that you encourage students to engage in, and I'm going to try to quote you, and I'm sorry if I get it wrong, the forceful assertion of alternatives in the face of oppression. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and where you see that happening in classical music?
Well, there's a lot of places where it's happening in classical music. The first thing, I'm looking for something that I don't know about or I haven't heard before. Even if I've heard it before, like I've listened to Parsifal or Giant Steps a million times. But I mean, every time you hear it, you hear something different in it. So you start, wow, I didn't know it was going to be like this. Or I had a piece played on the BBC Proms. It was an orchestra with electronics, and Ilan Volkov was conducting. And after that, he conducted Beethoven's Second Symphony. And all I could think of was, Jesus, why didn't I do that? I should have done this. And so there I am, sitting there listening, and not like I hadn't heard it before, but suddenly under the pressure of listening to it in the context of my music and realizing that all you could really do is approach what these people were doing. And so the idea is, in both cases, the goal is that people should leave the concert hall saying, well, wow, that was really different. I don't know if I've heard anything like that before. It was really different. And then they think for a minute and they say, well, I wonder what else could be different around here. And at that moment, that's why art is subversive, because it makes you think that change is possible, that difference leads to new vistas of understanding, and we should embrace these kinds of new differences. So I'm thinking about that, and that's when you begin to assert forceful alternatives, is when you want to recognize the importance of doing something we haven't tried to do before, or to find new perspectives in things that you think you already know about. Continuous introspection is also a form of creating alternatives.
What are some guiding principles, if you have any, that you like to live by?
I like to connect people. You see people and you think, well, wow, wouldn't it be great if these two people got together? Or wouldn't it be great if we could hear these musics in juxtaposition? So I try to foster that. I used to believe you couldn't invite everyone to the same party. I'm not so sure about that now. So it's a spirit of generosity and a spirit of connectivity, I think, are the things I try to do wherever possible.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. That brings me to the end of my questions. And for me, I mean, I found myself, especially in researching you and listening to your lectures, just seeing new perspectives and feeling my sort of consciousness expand. So for me, this is what the work is all about. And I definitely have so much appreciation for you and your work and you taking the time to spend some time with us.
Well, I appreciate that very much, David and Shay. It's very nice these great questions and everything. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
This episode of Black Music Scene was written and produced by David Norville. Special thanks goes to Shay Scruggs for joining me in today's episode. The Black Orchestral Network is sponsored by the Gateways Music Festival and generously supported by the Mellon Foundation and New York State Council on the Arts. The Black Music Scene podcast is a product of the Black Orchestral Network, where our mission is to cultivate community, lift our voices, and tell our stories. If you'd like to get involved and support the Black Orchestral Network, please visit blackorchestralnetwork.org. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.